Thank you everyone for making it all the way to the end of the conference here. Happy to close you out. Actually, Laura and I were at lunch together talking about how some people are very regimented and some people are a little more, let's say, fluid or dynamic. I am on the what was the term I just said? I'm the order Muppet. You know, there's like order Muppets in Chaos Muppet theory, right? Where like Ernie's a Chaos Muppet, Bert's an order Muppet. I'm an order Muppet type, regimented. So every weekday morning, for example, at 6 a.m., my alarm goes off, I get up, I go down the stairs, I do some kind of exercise, either it's walking or running or Peloton, and then I go back upstairs, I go in the shower, get dressed, go back down, have my breakfast, and then at around like 7:45, I take one of my kids to school. Now, there's a group of friends I have that are sort of scattered about North America and Europe, and they had a standing Zoom call at like every second Friday at 8 a.m. And 8 a.m. didn't work for me because I had to take my kid to school at 7:45. But one day they moved it to 7 a.m. And I was like, yes, okay, I can attend, but I need to change my schedule a little bit. So I still get up at 6, but now instead of going down and doing exercise, I take a shower first, go downstairs, have my breakfast, 7 o'clock, I get on the Zoom call. I'm enjoying sort of, kibitzing, talking with folks. And then at around 7:30, it dawns on me that my house is too quiet, that no one has gotten up. And I go upstairs, my wife is still in bed sleeping, both my kids are still in bed sleeping. And so it turns out that, when I get up at 6, that doesn't wake up my wife. It's too early for her, so she stays in bed. But what had been happening was when I would come upstairs for my 7 a.m. shower, that would naturally wake her up. She doesn't set an alarm, right? She's more on the Chaos Muppet side. And so me taking a shower at 7 woke her up each morning, and then she would wake up the kids. And the fact that I had changed my schedule led to this sort of weird incident that happened in our house where nobody got up, right? So my morning regimented routine had a functional role that nobody, including myself or my wife, actually knew until it changed and something broke. So I'm here today to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is stories, and to try to convince you that it should be, if not your favorite topic, then something that is very compelling and interesting and extremely relevant for us, in particular in SRE. And the reason I think it's interesting is because of this question, right? When something negative, surprising, unexpected happens, especially incidents, for example, there is frequently a human response, which is to ask, how could this bad thing have happened, right? How could this have happened? And stories are important because stories are a tool, a technology that we humans have developed to address that question, to answer that. We construct stories to make sense of these senseless events that have happened to us, right? So that's what we humans do. Now, another thing that's really great about stories is that they stick in your head in a way that, say, I don't know, reading like a memo or a slide with bullet points does not, right? Like we like telling stories. We remember them. We have stories back from millennia that have still been passed down successfully, where I think there are many docs that will not happen to. And I think that's particularly important because, so as was mentioned, I was formerly an academic. Academics talk about grand challenges in computer science. Like, here's a huge problem that we're all trying to work on. And to me, the grand challenge in software engineering is the challenge of how do you get the right information into the heads of the people who need it when they need it, right? I have seen many, many cases where either it was an incident that happened or a project got delayed because there was something that somebody didn't know, but someone else in the organization knew it, but didn't know that other person didn't know it, right? So that information wasn't in their head. Now, I could spend all of my time just reading docs, reading Slack channels, trying to absorb information, and still not read everything that I need, and I even wouldn't retain a lot of it, right? Like, I can read a doc, and it's not gonna stick in my head. But stories stick in people's heads. Now, I'm really here to talk specifically about how stories relate to the idea of incidents. So let's talk about that. So why talk about stories in the context of incidents? And there's this quote which has been attributed to Otto von Bismarck. I don't think they've actually confirmed that, but it's just too good a quote for me to not use here. So even though it's probably, he didn't say it, I'm still gonna bring it up. And he says that only a fool learns from his own mistakes. The wise man learns from the mistakes of others, right? And more generally speaking, not just mistakes, but like we can learn even from the good things that other people do, from their positive experiences, not just their mistakes. And if you happen to attend the discussion track on learning the other day that was run by John Alspaugh and Colette Alexander, you might have heard this phrase, vicarious learning. So the best way to learn is through direct experience, right? We all know that. That's why like a resume makes you more valuable because of your own personal experiences. But the next best way is to learn through someone else. In particular, a really good way that I've found is to watch someone else, right? So if you can watch someone else work directly, that can be a very powerful way to learn. Now, for example, back in the before time when everyone was co-located, when I would come onto a new team, like shoulder surfing someone who was doing like diagnostic work on like the dashboards was like hugely valuable to me. I learned so much watching them in action, watching an expert in action performing a particular task. Now, we don't always have the opportunity to watch someone directly, but we can use stories to sort of indirectly watch them, to capture a story of them doing something in action. And a really great example of this from a different domain is this book, From Novice to Expert. This is a book written in the 1980s by a nursing researcher, Patricia Benner. This is like, they republished it 20 years later. And what she was doing research into skilled nursing, right? She wanted to understand the difference between like, as nurses progress from novice to expert. And one of the ways that she did that is by interviewing nurses and getting them to talk specifically about certain scenarios that they had encountered, specific cases. And she used that to illustrate different skills, right? So she has sort of like a catalog of skills in this book that nurses have. And then she has like a little vignette, she called them exemplars, right? A little interview thing where she has the nurse walk through what happened in that particular scenario. So to make this a little more concrete, I'll give some specific examples of some of the skills she looked at. So one case in her research was a patient came in and the doctor who claimed to be in pain, the doctor didn't believe the patient was sort of getting hysterical. And the nurse who was experienced could tell that the patient was actually in pain, was not faking. Based on her experience, she was able to tell from cues that this was a serious thing and this patient needed to be treated for pain. So that's a little specific to nursing. I mean, we have issues with customer pain, we call it, but I think it's a different kind of skill. But there are some that I was reading this and I'm like, wow, these sound very similar to the kinds of things that we actually have to do ourselves. So this is a nursing skill right from the book, which is being able to detect when a patient is sort of deteriorating, when they're getting worse, but their vital signs are still all right, right? So it's not obvious. You can think like the alerts haven't fired yet, but you're watching the dashboard and you see, oh, that signal's going down, and I know that shape, like things are going bad. We need to do something now before they get worse, right? And she has an interview where she captures that in a particular case. And then one more, which is like, I saw this and I'm like, wow, this is very like resilience engineering-y. This is the challenge of when you have an increase in demands on the system and you're out of resources and you need to get more. And so in her example, it was, well, an emergency room situation, they're out of blood, right? And the expert nurse actually knew where to go to get more blood in that case and told someone, okay, go here. You can only get like 2 units, but that's all they'll give you, but go and do that now. And we have this problem all the time, right? When you have a system that is overloaded and is like, you're at capacity and then you have to take action. Maybe you have some knobs where you can cut certain kinds of traffic or you can do an emergency scale up. And that's a skilled thing, right? And it's gonna depend on what your current resources are. So it's a great example of a kind of skill that we have too. Now there's a great paper I really like, ironically from a statistician, Andrew Gelman, who has a great blog. He's a Colombian statistician. I say ironic because he's a statistician, but he's writing a paper about stories, not about statistics. So him with his co-author, Thomas Basball, is a writing consultant. And he wrote a paper about when are stories actually useful in social science? And he came up in their paper, the authors claim that there are two properties that a story needs to have to be useful for social science, for them to actually like sort of learn useful lessons from them. And the first criterion they come up with is that a good story has to be anomalous, right? It needs to be in some way unexpected. It doesn't match what you previously believed. The story, like, something's wrong with your current mental model. And there's a great paper, I'm gonna quote another paper here. Richard Cook's How Complex Systems Fail has been frequently brought up in our community. He wrote another really great paper that unfortunately is a little bit hard to find online. It's called 2 Years Before the Mast, Learning How to Learn About Patient Safety. And it's very similar to How Complex Systems Fail. It's a bunch of like pithy observations. But here's the one I want to call out in this context. And what he says there is that to learn something, there needs to be some sort of disconnect between what you currently believe and what you are experiencing, right? Only when that happens are you gonna refine. Like if it's like, well, this shows that I was right all along, like you're not gonna learn it. You haven't learned anything from that. So there really has to be something unexpected, something that you're wrong about. Now there was, I think Michelle Branch's talk at the beginning, right? She talked about it's scary when there's code that says like this should never happen in the code base. How many have like, when they're writing software, have experienced the situation where like you wrote the code and then it somehow got into a state which you think is like literally impossible. Like there's no way based on your understanding that the output should be that way or something's missing or right? So when we say that, right? When we say this should never happen, what we mean is I never expected that to happen, right? We mean that like our model of the world is somehow incompatible with the actual state of the world right now. And I guarantee that anyone who has felt that, once they finish debugging, they learned something about their software that they did not know at the beginning of the debugging process, right? That eventually it made sense, but you had to learn what you didn't know. So there's a painful learning process that takes place. I'll give an example from my own experience of this happening. And this has now happened to me several times. There's a scenario I've seen where there's some part of a microservice architecture where one of the services starts throwing errors. Now, the errors themselves, the system is handling gracefully, so the customers are not being impacted by the errors. But one of the byproducts is that it's generating a lot more logging than it was before. So for example, if you have worked in Java and you are logging full stack traces, you will note that like your logs can get a lot bigger because of that if there's a lot of traffic. So like if there's high traffic errors, even if the system is handling it, I've seen the log increase itself cause problems with the service and cause the service to fall over. And I've seen that in different forms with like the disk filling up. I've seen it even with like an async logger. There's still a buffer there and that buffer will eventually fill up and you'll still block even though you've got an async logger. And so before I first saw that, I didn't think that the logging system itself could be implicated in a system failing, right? I thought only like the errors had to be the problem. So that was a lesson that I've learned once and I've now seen it several times. The other criterion that they mention is that a good story is immutable. And I don't know, I think that's actually kind of a weird term that they use for this, so I'm gonna explain it in a little more detail because it wasn't intuitive to me what they meant by immutable. But by immutable, what Basball and Gelman meant was that as stories get passed down, what often happens is that like the details get sanded off, they get oversimplified. And for a story to be useful, you have to preserve the details. And when they get lost, the story loses what you can actually learn from it. And here I'll give an example. This is my one AI-generated slide. This is an AI-generated image of a system called the Therac-25, which is a radiation therapy machine back from the 1980s. It's funny to still be talking about this this is now, I guess, 40 or something odd years ago. But it is an example of a story in our industry that has persisted over time, even though we have many other examples of software failures, like high consequence software failures in the past 40 years. But you will still see people talking about SREcon25 like I am today. And so in this case, if you're not familiar with it, basically, there were at least 6 people who received like massive overdoses of radiation from the SREcon25 in the 80s because the device malfunctioned. And this was a computer-controlled device. So this was like an early example of a software safety case where safety was implicated in people being like seriously injured and actually dying. Now, when I learned this story, I first learned about this as being about race conditions, right? So this was a story where there was a race condition in the code, and that led to the overexposure of radiation from the machine. And it's true, there were race conditions in the code that contributed to this terrible accident. But I want to quote from Nancy Leveson and Clark Turner. I think Leveson has been mentioned in some of the STAMP talks. Before she worked on STAMP, she was still doing software safety stuff. And Leveson and Clark Turner did sort of like a case study based on all the public information they could gather at the time about these accidents. And they were already lamenting in the 90s, early 90s, that the story wasn't immutable, that like people were losing the details and it was important to preserve them. And that's why they decided to write this paper. And it's a great paper. I'm not gonna go into all the details, but I will cover just one aspect, which I think is particularly relevant because it touches the operator aspect. And what would happen, so they have an operator who's controlling the machine, and it would frequently error, and we would say like malfunction in an error code, right? So like this is the UX. And most of those errors were harmless, right? And you would just retry and it would be fine. Malfunction 54 means like incorrect dose, but it doesn't tell you if it's like too high or too low. And there was another gauge that like said that it was too low. And so they saw this and in one of the cases and just kept, okay, retry, that's what you normally do. And man, that's a terrible interface, like that poor operator. So there's more than just the race condition, right? This is like a hairy thing. And if you read the paper, Leveson was big at the time on saying, look, like her argument back then was like, you don't just want software guaranteeing the safety of the system. She was arguing for more hardware safety interlocks. But I wanted to call this out because we say this a lot now about, and I certainly believe this, right? That accidents are complex systems failures and there's multiple factors. It's nice to see that like even in the software world, there was someone talking about this back in the early 90s. I don't think we've convinced everyone yet, so it's taken a long time, but I don't know, it warmed my heart to see that in an older paper, because I have usually said this myself in the 2020s. All right, now when it comes to incidents, there are different kinds of sort of styles of stories about incidents that you can tell. My personal favorite kind of incident story is what I would call the horror story, right? So this is one that happened to me where I was on call. There was something really bad happening in one of the regions. Across multiple services, CPU utilization was elevated, no obvious cause. We had failover capability. I made the call, we didn't know what was going on. I made the call to failover, and then things were fine, and then several minutes later, oh no, in the new region, the problem has followed. I remember saying, oh no, the problem followed us. And I wrote a Slack message about that. I'm not gonna say more about that particular incident, but if you find me like at a bar one day, I'm very happy to talk about this one. So one of the ones that has really stuck in my mind. And actually I will say, the problem I thought I had pushed the problem into the other region, but that's not what had happened. There was a pipeline that was deploying first to one region and then to the next, and I didn't know what was going on, and so I moved the traffic, and the pipeline had succeeded in one region and went to the next, and I had no idea that coincidence. But in the moment, ooh. The other one, which I think is the more common one people do, which is also is the mystery, right? And incidents are almost always mysteries unless we figure them out right away. We're seeing something and we don't really understand it. I think the most common one is this one, right? Nothing has changed. All of a sudden, there's a drop in traffic, or there's like an error spike here, and there's nothing correlated in time, no feature flags, no deployments, no data changes. What is going on? Those are also good stories. My least favorite incident story is what I will call the morality tale. So an example of morality tale. So you're telling the story of an incident, and there was a test that existed, an end-to-end test in the staging environment. The test ran, the test failed, but the person who was deploying still anyways progressed it to production, and then we had an incident, right? Not a fan of the morality tale. And the morality tale is a great example of an oversimplification, right? This is the problem of a story not being immutable, but actually we haven't even gotten the details yet. So it's not like a complex story that got simplified. It's a story that's too simple to start out with. And so the solution to these oversimplified stories is this idea from the resilience engineering folks, which are called second stories. So you start off with the initial story that comes out might be like a very simple thing. Oh, it was, and like often things are moving quickly. Oh, it was a new person, didn't realize X or whatever. But then later on you dig in and you see there's a lot more going on than your first impressions right afterwards. And I'm gonna plug here, once again from healthcare, there was a workshop that was held on patient safety about two stories in the 90s. This was held by Richard Cook, David Woods, and Charlotte Miller. And this is a workshop about second stories. And you can see from the medical field, they have examples of the first stories and then the more details of the second stories. And it's really great. And there's also some really good stuff in the appendix here about the history. This is just an aside, but the history of the aviation reporting system where you can anonymously report issues. That was actually done by a guy who had a medical background and then tried to do it in the medical community and failed. But I highly recommend this workshop report on second stories. All right, now a story is never like the whole truth, and the details of a story are always gonna vary based on the storyteller, right? So different people will tell stories from different perspectives, and you can get a very, very different view of things because of that. And I'm going to illustrate this with another sorry, I already said that. Different storytellers will have different perspectives on the story. I'm gonna take another example of another story that has persisted with us for on the order of 40 years, and this is the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, where upon launch, the Challenger broke apart and all of the astronauts on board were killed because of it. Now, there was an official presidential commission to investigate what happened. One of the people on the commission is the American physicist Richard Feynman. He's kind of a character, you've probably heard about him. Very opinionated guy. And in addition to the consensus write-up of what happened, Feynman insisted on having his own appendix where he talked in more detail about his perspective. And from his point of view, Challenger was a story of estimation error. In particular, that the engineers and managers had wildly different estimates on how risky any particular launch was, right? So he thought this was a story of management at NASA vastly underestimating what the risks of launch were in general compared to the engineers. So this is a quote from this appendix. We could properly ask, this is the words of Feynman, what is the cause of management's fantastic faith in the machinery? Right, so that's one story about the Challenger. There's another story told by the American statistician Edward Tufte. You might have he's written several books about information visualization. And to Tufte, the Challenger is a story about bad information visualization. So some of the details of the Challenger explosion was there are these gaskets called O-rings that prevent hot gas from going through. And the temperature was very low on the day that the launch happened, and the gaskets failed because of the temperature being too low. And the engineers were trying to make a decision on the day of launch, is it safe to launch based on the operational history of the behavior of the gaskets in the past. And his argument was that the graphs that they were, the visualization they had put up was terrible, and so they came to the wrong conclusion because of that. All right, so this is Tufte. He has a book called Visual Explanations, where he talks about what happened. And here's a quote from him. "In the 13 charts prepared for making the decision to launch, a scandalous discrepancy between the intellectual tasks at hand and the images created to serve those tasks." But not surprising maybe that an InfoVis guy is going to say, look, it's an InfoVis problem, right? Similarly, Diane Vaughan, who was an American sociologist, told a sociological story about what happened. So she did basically a case study, an investigation on what happened in the lead up to the launch and how the decision was made. And she actually developed a new sort of concept she called normalization of deviance. And now, let me ask, how many folks here have ever tuned a noisy alert where like the threshold is like too low on an error alert, and so you make it less sensitive, right? That's normalization of deviance. That's what it is. You've set some, like, this is the operational range that the system, I believe the system needs to be in, and if it exceeds that, there's a problem. And then your system exceeds it, you have some experience, but actually you say, no, the system's actually healthy there. Like, I can loosen that threshold, it's fine. The system is healthy, it doesn't have to be at 0.2% error rate, it can go up to 0.5, right? That is a normal thing, we all do that all of the time. And so to Vaughan, this normalization of deviance was part of the standard NASA culture and processes for their experience over time with the operational behavior. So her is a mistake based on conformity to cultural beliefs, organizational rules and norms, and NASA's bureaucratic, political, and technical culture. Now, I'm not going to arbitrate across these three stories. I'm not a domain expert here, but I just want to note these are very, very different ways to look at the same series of events. And so the story you get is never the complete picture, right? We cannot do that. You're always viewing it through a particular lens. And you can get radically different stories from different lenses. All right, so what, Lorin? Okay, you've told us all this stuff. What am I supposed to do with this? And I hope the one takeaway that I hope you take from this is when you are doing your incident write-ups, people call them postmortems, tell it as a story. That this is what I implore you. People will remember it better if you do that. Now, sometimes people ask me, Lorin, like, what should I put in my postmortem template? And like, yeah, you need a title, you need like a summary, but really, like, all I personally care about if you're handing me an incident write-up is one section called narrative description, that is the story. And the other stuff, you can put stuff in there, I might read it, I might not. That's all I care about. That's the one. If you ask me for a template, there's my incident template, postmortem template, narrative description. And what that narrative description should do is it should describe how the events of the incident unfolded over time. And one thing I have often found difficult to read in some people's write-ups is that the timing is all jumbled, right? They want to talk about like the impact as it happened, but then like, well, why did it happen? And they try to go backwards. But like, we can't process information well like that. Like, it's better to tell it over time. And now, the story may have started a long time ago. I mean, I've seen and I've written incident write-ups that have started months or years before, right? The seeds are often planted, way before impact starts, right? And if you want to make sense of the incident, you should start your write-up back then. Now, people often put timelines, and I do think timelines are good. I like to put it in the appendix. But a timeline is like an undifferentiated like series of events, right? Like this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. This is the like, was a one damn thing after another theory of history. I can't personally process like just a linear list of events like that. So when you're doing your incident write-up as a narrative, what I would suggest is that you chunk it. You have like, especially if you start like before, like you have like a subheading and okay, like the original PR is submitted, right? Da, 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 da. And then like, maybe you have a section where like the deployment first happens or whatever, and then like there's the response, and then maybe someone else somewhere is doing something. Like just organize it into meaningful chunks. You might have to jump in time a little bit because like sometimes you'll often have multiple teams in parallel working on stuff, right? And so you can have different episodes for the different teams that are responding. But your readers will thank you. They'll be easier for them to make sense of it if you chunk your writing into episodes. Now, I am personally partial to using incident review meetings to do incident storytelling, but unfortunately, I'm generally in the minority there, right? People want to talk about like action items, corrective actions, and it's often not an option to just say, no, we're just going to focus on what happened in the incident. I would like that to be the case, but it's just not going to happen. Too many people really want to talk about action items and what are we going to do. So what I would suggest, or what I actually even do, is that if you cannot use the incident review meeting itself to do incident storytelling, you can have another meeting where you do incident storytelling, where you just focus on that. And in particular, we do this at Airbnb. So every quarter, we have 3 incident storytellers. We have a session. It doesn't matter how recent they are. Some of them are like years old. This is actually something that was brought over by, so I co-run this with another engineer there, Nikolaj Nielsen, who brought it over from Twitter. So there was a once upon an incident at Twitter. He brought it over here. I was talking about the importance of like narrative descriptions. I was pitching for this for updating the incident, the template. And he's like, you know what, for stories, we should do this. Once upon an incident. And I was like, yes, we should. And we were gonna do it. And now we do it. And it's pretty well attended. And it's just like, he calls them like around the campfire stories, right? And we get, I think we got like 100 people last time. I mean, I like that. Like, so I'm very happy that we've done this. So we've made some space where we're just doing incident storytelling and there's no pressure to do like corrective actions because they're not like immediate incidents, and people are still interested even if they happened years ago, and you can still learn things from them where the action items are long gone. Now, storytelling, like so many other things, is itself a skill, right? It is something that, while we are all natural sort of like receivers of stories, we're not all natural relators, tellers of stories. But like all skills, you will get better at storytelling the more you practice doing it. And so if you see value in it, I would highly recommend you practice doing storytelling. And actually, it's a great sort of general life skill. When you socialize with people here, one thing people love to do is tell stories. Now, fortunately for us in the SRE world, we get to see a lot of incidents. And incidents are a fantastic source of stories because there are these anomalous things, right? Every time an incident, nobody expects an incident to happen, right, by their nature. If you're scheduling your incidents, I mean, that's amazing. I frequently, like, I would recommend if you schedule them, never schedule 2 at the same time. I always tell people that when we hit 2, like, co-incident incidents in the future, people please schedule them separately. But always incidents are a surprise, which means you have like a never-ending source of stories you can tell for practice. If you are interested in actively improving your storytelling skills, I recommend these 2 books. One of them is Storycraft by Jack Hart. Hart is he no longer is. He was the editor of a long-form news magazine, The Oregonian, right? So his book is about writing narrative nonfiction. And an incident write-up is narrative nonfiction. That's what it is. And so he has some really great advice there. On the other hand, Storyworthy by Matthew Dix is about oral storytelling, right? Dix is like a competitive storyteller. And he has a lot of advice and exercises you can do if you want to improve your ability to tell stories. And man, everybody loves a good storyteller. This is the last quote I have. This is from the Israeli late psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who said he did a lot of research on how people make decisions, but he said, this was, I think, in a story this is not in one of his papers. This is like, I think a journalist was interviewing him. And he said that, like, in reality, no one ever made a decision because of a number, right? They need a story. It's a story that is the thing that ends up convincing someone to make a decision. And in that spirit, we'll leave you with this. Go out and tell a good story. Thank you.